he was not a happy camper. So we get up there the next morning and we're sitting in the office. My dad, very quiet cowboy, but I tell you, when he got to a point, it was all over with the shower, okay? So we get in there, and Mr. Goyette, the same guy that kicked Roger Bertle out of school, is the principal. And he's sitting there, and my dad and I sat down, Mr. Schlinbold's there, and Mr. Goyette says, he said, well, Randy, would you please tell us what happened here? So I tell him the story, and I don't think Ed believes me. I don't think the principal believes that this could possibly be true, and I know dang well my dad doesn't. Anyway, he turns to Mr. Schlinbold, he says, now, Mr. Schlinbold, can you tell me your version of this story? He said, well, that's exactly right. What he said is exactly right. And my dad kind of looked at him, I'll never forget, and he says, well, you know, Mr. Schlinbold, he said, you know, I respect teachers, and if my son did something wrong in your class, I will support you. I mean, he can come in and clean desks, he can scrub the toilets, you know, for the janitors, he can help the janitors for a week clean, mop your floor on his knees, I don't care. But he's not eating that chocolate. I mean, that's just not going to happen. Which I was kind of surprised. I thought my dad said, you get over there and start eating it. I really did. It wouldn't have surprised me. It really would not. That's the difference. It wouldn't have surprised me. I had to give my dad a little credit, but I thought sure he was eating his chocolate. But anyway, so Mr. Schlinbold looks at my dad, not knowing him very well, and he says, well, Mr. Burry says, that's not going to work. The only way he's getting in is if he eats his chocolate. And my dad's neck just started getting like red from this. And I thought we were going to go fist sitting. I thought this was going to turn into a fist sitting. I'm not kidding you. Because my dad was hardcore, but his manhood was challenged a little bit. So at that time, Mr. Goyette, who kicked Roger Bertle out of school, Mr. Goyette says, well, hey, Mr. Dirk, could you take Randy out in the office area? Mr. Schlinbold and I'll have a discussion. And my dad, I don't know, come on, Dad, come on. You know, we get out there and I can hear this wah, wah, yelling inside the office. And Mr. Goyette opens the door and he's as calm as he can be. He says, would you guys come back in? And he says, Mr. Schlinbold and I have talked, and we've decided that your son can get back into class on the apology that he gave earlier when I was back in class, but it didn't go well the rest of the year. Okay? The point I'm making is that if that happens today, the parent goes in and is going to blame everybody but the person. And although my dad knew I wasn't a perfect angel, he might have thought, well, you didn't do it this time, but I'm sure you had before. That's why it surprised me I didn't have to eat the chalk in his mind, but I didn't. But the point being is we've really kind of lost our minds. When parents come in now, when their kids are really in trouble and do something wrong, there's always excuses, and it's somebody else's fault. And I think that all started, to be honest with you, in the 1960s. Okay? So that's my spiel, story, and soapbox today. We'll move on to the next subtopic. Okay? And the next subtopic is the problem of violence in the 1960s. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you 6 examples of things that happened in the 1960s that led to violence in America. Now you should know some of them because we've talked about some of them. We'll see what you can come up with. The other class came up with the ones that I wanted to come up with. We'll see how you do. So can anybody think of any event or any issue that happened in the 1960s that we've talked about that eventually led to violence? The Vietnam War. There you go. That's one. The Vietnam War. Now, why did that lead to violence? Because that thing was fought a long ways from here. So why would that lead to violence in the United States? Well, first of all, the nightly news coverage, 90% of your broadcast was about the Vietnam War, and included in that broadcast was the body counts of how many were killed and how many were wounded, and people, you know, took offense to that. And so what did they start to do when they started not liking the numbers? Protesting. And those things turned out violent as well, like the one at Columbia University when those people went in there and took over the office and took people hostage and then got the heck beat out of them by police that came in and straightened things out. So the Vietnam War was absolutely an example of an issue that occurred in the 1960s that resulted in violence in this country. How about something else we've talked about? Civil rights movement, no question about it. Civil rights movement was another issue. What happened in the civil rights movement? Civil rights protesters were beaten by not only racist people, but also by police. Okay? How about the 3 men that were murdered and buried in the earthen dam? Right? How about what happened to people when they marched to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma the first time? All on national television for everybody to see nightly. Okay? So absolutely the civil rights movement. So the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. How about another thing? The third thing you should get that happened, we had 3 of them in 5 years. Political assassinations. Now you think about these. We had one in 1963 in which not only was the President of the United States assassinated, but the assassin of the President was assassinated. Okay? So you had a political assassination of a President and his killer assassinated. Then in 1 year, in a matter of 3 months, in April of 1968, you've got the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and 3 months later, you've got the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Within a 3-month period of time, we've had 3 major political assassinations in this country in 5 years. We haven't had anything even close to it since. We've had attempted assassinations on presidents, but nobody successful, and especially 3 in 5 years, 2 in 3 months. Okay, definitely led to violence in the 1960s. Okay, another thing that I haven't got to yet is 2 things. Movies and music groups led to violence in the 1960s. Now, you don't think much of it now. I mean, back in the early 1960s, if you watched an episode of Gunsmoke, anybody ever watch Gunsmoke or Bonanza? When somebody gets shot, is there blood and guts flying everywhere? No, I mean, they just put their hands like this, they go down, and then they talk for a while, and then they go, okay, that's what they do. You go watch one now. I watched the movie Inglourious Bastards last night. Have you ever seen that one? Yeah. Anyway, some guy beats some other guy over the head with a baseball bat, and there's brains and everything flying everywhere. That would not have happened. And what I'm meaning is, movies became much more violent. Probably the most violent movie in the 1960s, and to your standards it wouldn't be violent, but it was then, was a movie called Bonnie and Clyde. Called Bonnie and Clyde. Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway were Bonnie and Clyde. I have the movie. And it was really a shoot-'em-up type movie in which showed a little blood and guts, and that was a shock. And movies started to do that. Just like they started showing nudity to get people to watch, they started to show violence to get people to watch. Musical groups started having drug messages in their lyrics and violent lyrics in their messages, in their songs, which was new. It's not probably get into some rap today, it probably all is that. But in those days, you just didn't see that, okay? Subliminal messages, like the Beatles had an album where if you put it on the turntable and played it backwards, it said, "We buried Paul." And the rumors were flying that Paul McCartney had died, but that was the only one. They would do like violent and drug messages on their albums in which you played them backwards, and it would say, it would tell you things. I'm not kidding you. Yeah, it was crazy. So movies and music groups started to contribute to violence in the United States through their lyrics and their scenes. The consumer culture led to violence. What's the consumer culture? I was kind of impressed the other class, actually somebody knew what the consumer culture was. That's exactly, very good, the buying and selling of things. What was really targeted as far as the consumer culture that led to violence? Toys. That's where the toy Tommy gun came out. You still have them today, boy, you could get one of those and you could pull her back and ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. Those weren't really things that people had a lot of, and they were made by the thousands to sell to kids. Army men, big deal. Got to have army men. Got to have all kinds of army men. And you're portraying battles and all that thing. But the biggest symbol of the consumer culture at the time, and there's a history behind it, was the G.I. Joe. The G.I. Joe, which was basically a doll for boys, which was a little unusual, because boys didn't have dolls in the 50s, right? But these were a big deal. Now this is a replica of the 1964 original G.I. Joe in the box. I have 2 at home that are not replicas, that are worth a lot of money. And what's worth the most? The G.I. Joe that comes in the box. Because nobody saved the box. When a kid got one of these for Christmas, tore the thing out of there and threw the box away, right? Never kept the box. But this is one here. How you can tell if you, and not being weird, but it's how it is, if on the back end, hind end of the G.I. Joe is where they mark the copyright and the year. So if you have an original G.I. Joe, you look at his rear end, and it will have a stamp on it, copyright 1964 Hasbro. Okay, this one is a replica here, but because I'm not bringing real ones up here. Okay, G.I. Joes went kind of crazy, and they were very popular. They even decided it was time to make them racially equal. And so after a period of time when they made the G.I. Joes that were first all white, they decided then that they were going to make G.I. Joes that were African American, which was, probably a good thing. And they really got popular, but people all of a sudden started protesting the war, and sales went down on G.I. Joes, so Hasbro decided to change their view from G.I. Joe the Army Man to G.I. Joe the Adventure Hero. And the boxes started saying that on them. And they changed, and the copyright of these came out in 1968, and they had the fuzzy hair and the beards, and they weren't dressed in this is military garb, but these guys came out in kind of adventure, hiking and camping and those types of things. But this G.I. Joe thing has been kind of crazy. They even have a G.I. Joe of John F. Kennedy. Here's the JFK G.I. Joe. And if you look up over here, I've got all kinds of different ones. Now these are replicas, but there were originals in each of these in the 60s. There's the action pilot, the action sailor, the action marine, the action soldier. I even have an honor guard G.I. Joe that replicates the honor guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I've got one here from D-Day. I've got one here from the Vietnam Wall, where there is a G.I. Joe that is at the Vietnam Wall paying tribute to his fallen comrades. There's one right there, John Glenn, okay, from Mercury 7 project, and then here's a Mercury astronaut as well. I've kind of forgotten who this is. This opens up as well, and this is Shepard, I guess. So you can see them there. So they're still popular today. You can find G.I. Joes today. I always find joy in going on eBay and finding a 1964 in the box. They go from anywhere from $400 or $500 to $2,000, depending on the shape they're in. So the consumer culture, a lot of toys were made that were based on violence in the Vietnam War, and after the protests came out, they kind of changed their viewpoint from the G.I. Joe soldier to the G.I. Joe adventure hero. Okay? Now, the last example is one that's probably the most interesting, and that's the drug culture. The drug culture. And I might be giving you new information. I hope I am, because if I'm not, you know more about this than you should. But the two drugs that were most prevalently used in the 1960s were marijuana and LSD. And I'll talk about LSD and marijuana individually. Here's a question for you. When do you think, what year do you think marijuana was first outlawed or made illegal in the United States? What this row guess? Somebody, what do you think? What year do you think it was outlawed? What'd you get? 68? 92? After, so like in the 30s? Okay. 90s? What do you think, kiddos? 50s? Carla Gayton, you're awesome. 1937. Most people think like 90s, because it's made a comeback. But I'm just going to tell you the story. It was outlawed in 1937 when they figured out it was not normal. And it really went away from 1937 until the 1960s, when it was rediscovered that it was a way to get you high. And I think it kind of went away in the 80s and 90s and was rediscovered again around 2000, and kids are kind of into it again. So it's made circles here. But it was first outlawed in 1937. And it made a rediscovery of the American youth in the 1960s, and they used it as a way to get, quote, high. Now there were some specific advantages for the youth to use marijuana in the 1960s. It might be the same advantages today. Hopefully you don't know that. But anyway, these were the advantages.
Hey, real quick, sorry. I don't know if this got told you guys, but homework lunch and lunch detention is with Mr. Ivy. So if you have it, either one of those things, you're in Mr. Ivy.
Okay, so here's why you had specific advantages of the youth culture. First of all, at the time, marijuana was very inexpensive and very available. So if it's inexpensive and available, it's pretty much an advantage to those that use it, right? Inexpensive and available. Now, to be real honest with you, have I ever done marijuana? Sure, did it in college. Not very much. I'd tell you if I did it every day. I didn't, because I couldn't afford it. And my buddies weren't really into giving it to me when they had to pay for it. It was pretty expensive in this, in the 70s, okay? And I just couldn't afford it, so I never used it much, okay? Might have drank a little beer in my day, but I never used a lot of marijuana. Now, another reason why marijuana was such an advantage for the youth culture is it was acceptable. It was okay, everybody's doing it. It's okay, you can smoke marijuana, hell, everybody's doing it. All the youth of America is smoking marijuana, so it was widely accepted. Now it also, according to those that used it in the 60s, heightened a person's form of perception. You became more perceptive if you smoked marijuana. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but more perceptive, became more alert, you could see things better. Did you ever see the movie Tommy Boy? Yeah. Where he said if the bug was coming at the window or something or whatever he was doing. That was kind of that was from nitrous oxide or whatever, but the perception of the bug and seeing the bug hit the windshield, okay? And another thing it did, and I think it does do this, is it breaks down your inhibitions and it'll give you a little more confidence. You might, kind of like alcohol, you might say something that you wouldn't say after being under the influence of alcohol or marijuana because you might get a little confidence, okay? And people kind of did that too. The argument, I want to talk about marijuana just a little bit. The argument today about marijuana is that it should be legalized, right? We've all heard that. I think people's philosophy is if you get drunk, you're more apt to beat your wife than if you smoke marijuana, because marijuana is not that, it's not a drug that hypes you up, so to speak. And professional athletes are really on this roll right now. And the NHL has went ahead and okayed for their athletes to use marijuana because the athletes are arguing, you know what, I hurt myself, I get hurt, you give me all these painkillers that I get addicted to, but you won't let me smoke marijuana, which should be my better way for me to get rid of the pain. Right or wrong, that's the argument today. And some sports are saying, maybe that's not bad, and some sports are banning it still. But the athletes are saying, so I tear out my knee and you give me oxycodone, which I take and take and take because my knee hurts, and you give me those like candy, and pretty soon I'm addicted to it. If you'd let me smoke marijuana, I wouldn't need the pills. So that's the big argument now. And we're talking about medical marijuana and all kinds of things right now. But marijuana has made a comeback, no question, from probably 2000 on. The second drug that we talk about that you probably don't know as much about, I would hope, is LSD. And I cannot say this correctly every time, but it's on I believe I have it on your sheet. It's called lysergic acid dithalamide. I'll say it once, and from that point on we'll go with LSD just to save myself some trouble. But anyway, it was a very popular drug in the 1960s known as LSD, and it was a hallucinogenic drug. Okay, it would give you hallucinations. Okay? Now, if you take LSD, it inhibits the serotonin in your brain. It inhibits the serotonin in your brain. Anybody know what serotonin does with your brain?
It makes you have it's like a good feeling.
Yeah, well, it's a transmitter of your nerve impulses, right? So it's in the brain tissue and it helps you transport your nerves. Well, what happens if you take LSD, it inhibits serotonin, which doesn't let brain waves get to where they kind of were supposed to. Now, the use of LSD would give you the trip of a lifetime. It'd give you a dream, a hallucinogenic dream, and it affected people in different ways. There was no consistency on the high you received. So Carla might take LSD and wake up the next morning and feel like $1 million. And I might take LSD and wake up like somebody, like a grizzly bear ate me and then crap me over the cliff. You know what I mean? And then the next time Carla takes it, she might get that same bad feeling and I might get it. You never could predict it. And that was the thing that was kind of bad of it, okay? And LSD would act within about 30 to 60 minutes, and its effects usually lasted 8 to 10 hours, and some effects lasting several days. So if you're having a good hallucinogenic dream on LSD, probably okay. But if you're having a bad trip, is what they called it, it could be devastating, and you could do lots of things to harm yourself, okay? Now here's basically what you could feel if you used LSD. These are the symptoms in users, and this is what we'll finish with today, and then we'll tell you how it was discovered Monday. Okay? So this is what you'd usually feel if you were on LSD. You could have tremendous mood shifts. You could be really happy one minute, really mad the next. Tremendous mood shifts with LSD. you would really have time and space distortions. In other words, you wouldn't have any idea that it was only 5 minutes. It might have seemed like 5 hours to you, or 5 hours might have seemed like 5 minutes. And space distortions, like between Nye and I, it might seem like I'm right in her face, or it might seem like she's 3 miles away. You had space distortions and time distortions. Another bad thing about LSD is you had impulse behavior. And if you're having a bad trip and all of a sudden you have an hallucination that you're about to get shot by somebody, or you're about to fall off a cliff, or something dangerous is going to happen to you, you may do something in your dream to prevent that, which would be harmful to you. So impulse behavior was another symptom of LSD use. You would do things you normally wouldn't do impulsively. Another thing, you became incredibly paranoid, suspicious of intentions and motives of others. So you might be standing next to your best friend that would never harm you in any way, and all of a sudden you'd feel like the person was going to knife you. I mean, you had a lot of paranoia went on with LSD trips. A lot of paranoia and suspicion of people around you. And not always, but possibly aggressive behavior, especially if you were having a trip, so to speak, that was not one of the positive nature. It could result in aggressive behavior. Now, I'm going to show you a great mini-series called The 1960s. You will love it when we get back from DC. And it's kind of a dramatization of a family that went through all these things that we're talking about. And you'll see some of these exact things we talked about. So LSD was kind of an interesting thing, and I'll finish with this. LSD is a chemical that was accidentally discovered by a Swedish scientist by the name of Albert Hofmann. Albert Hofmann. So LSD was a chemical that was accidentally developed